I'm really excited to be here with you today. As was mentioned on Sunday night, I was once a student at Mises University. Now, that was a very long time ago. That was before we even called it Mises University. Back then, it was just Mises Community College. But we've grown, we've expanded since then. I also want to echo something that Tom Woods said in his talk. I mean, as far as the experience of being out there, but now being on this side of the podium, it really is an honor, but also a responsibility. I mean, like a cameraman at a Coldplay concert, I can really impact people's lives. And I do want to make a difference in your life today by talking about entrepreneurship and how it fits in with the Austrian understanding of markets and society. In the previous lecture, Professor Newman explained how social cooperation through the division of labor provides, substantial benefits and improvements in the quality of life. This is something that was very central to Mises' understanding of the market and of society. And, when we think about social cooperation through the division of labor, we emphasize the sort of bottom-up character of coordination, right? It's not necessary that different participants in the division of labor get together and sort of explicitly agree on what they want to do. I mean, they might do that, but it's certainly not necessary that they do so. Rather, the benefits emerge kind of in a decentralized bottom-up fashion. But it turns out in the Misesian system, there's also a role, and sometimes an underappreciated role, even among Austrian scholars, of the role of certain central coordinating agents. No, of course, I don't mean state planners or university professors, I mean entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs play a very fundamental role in the Austrian understanding of the market, which is why you have a lecture on entrepreneurship, on the first full day of the conference, rather than on Friday or something, in a session on miscellaneous applied topics. I was sort of inspired to frame my discussion by an article that I read just a few weeks ago. This was published at the end of February. It's a sort of a review essay by a very prominent macroeconomist named Charles Calarimis, who was for a long time a professor at Columbia University. He's now emeritus, and he was reviewing a book by another professor named Amar Bideh on uncertainty and enterprise. And the way he opens his review, this in the Wall Street Journal, he says, microeconomists, meaning people who study the market, right, have been trying to make sense of entrepreneurship as a distinct category of activity for more than a century. That's a fair statement. And then he says, Calarimis says, during my graduate school days at Stanford, a classmate asked Kenneth Arrow, the economist and Nobel laureate, to comment on the Austrian School of Economics' emphasis on entrepreneurship as essential to economic progress. Arrow expressed skepticism that entrepreneurship was different from other kinds of business management and did not seem to believe that it required special analysis. Okay, so I have to imagine, from Arrow's point of view, this might have been sort of a strange a conversation. A student asks, in a class on, I guess, microeconomic theory, mathematical microeconomic theory. As a lot of you know, Arrow was a contributor to sort of this standard general equilibrium approach, what we sometimes call the Arrow-Debreu model, named after two Nobel laureate mathematical economists. And somebody says, hey, what do you think about the Austrian school and their understanding of entrepreneurship? And I don't know exactly when this conversation took place. I can guess by when the author was in graduate school. But apparently Arrow said something like, entrepreneurs exist, but there's nothing special about what they do. It's a kind of business management, and we can study it the same way we study other kinds of business management. Now, I know that Arrow, certainly had some familiarity with the Austrian school, because when I read this, I was reminded of a very influential event in my own career history, which of course you all want to know about. Back in the early 90s, the Mises Institute helped arrange a lecture series at Stanford University, and it was named for the primary sponsor, whose name was Robert Doffelmeyer. He was a great entrepreneur and a supporter of the Mises Institute. He was a member of what was then called the Institute Entrepreneurs Council. And he sponsored this series of lectures at Stanford, which was his alma mater, at which Austrian economists, Austrian scholars were invited to come in and give a talk. And then a prominent Stanford economist would give a response. And these were kind of small, it was 25, 30 people, kind of a small, intimate setting where you got to see these heavyweights kind of go at it. I remember one time George Selgin was invited to give a talk on free banking, and his discussant was Thomas Sargent, who would later become a Nobel laureate for rational expectations theory. Anyway, so they invited Murray Rothbard to give this talk and Kenneth Arrow to give the response. And these are two, very senior and highly accomplished intellectuals, both from New York City. You had sort of a lot in common. They had similar backgrounds and so forth. And, I was a young graduate student myself in those days. And I thought it was great. And of course, spoiler, I thought Rothbard made the better case than Arrow. But I never forget Arrow kind of began his response by saying something like, well, I really don't know that much about the Austrian School. It's kind of like, I'm not sure who this Rothbard character is. He said, I've never really read anything by Mises. I think I might have read an article by Hayek once. And then he went on to kind of give a standard kind of mainstream mathematical critique of Rothbard's presentation, but it didn't engage at a very deep level. It was pretty superficial. And I don't believe those meetings were recorded. It would be great if they were. I'd love to watch that video again and look at the transcript. But, it sort of highlighted that for someone like Arrow, it wasn't that he thought that core Austrian concepts, whether it's the praxeological method or the Austrian understanding of entrepreneurship, it's not that he thought they were, fundamentally in error and needed to be refuted or attacked. He just thought they were kind of inconsequential. Like, yeah, maybe there's some truth in there, but it's already incorporated in, my model, and it's not anything that's worth my time. And so clearly, even I think that must have been before the incident described in the Wall Street Journal article. Arrow never really came around to the idea that Austrian views were worth addressing. Okay, so I'll ask my question, kind of echoing the way it was described by Arrow, right? Is entrepreneurship, different from other kinds of business management? Does it require a special analysis, right? Or is it just like, I don't know, clothing sales? We could do the economics of clothing sales, or we could do the economics of, startups or something, but it's kind of not all that interesting or important. So, I'm painting with a slightly broad brush here, but I think it's fair to say that kind of in most of the mainstream texts, right, entrepreneurship is regarded as, a certain kind of labor service. Okay, so labor is, an activity performed by human actors. They're exchanging their labor services in exchange for some kind of a payment, a wage, right? And just as you could work, you could work at a car wash and then you're getting paid for washing cars, you could also work in the form of starting a company, right? Or maybe growing an existing company, managing a small business, something like that, introducing a new product. That's just another kind of labor. And you get some kind of, compensation for that, and we could call it a wage, even if, the IRS calls it something else, okay? The entrepreneurial service in this view can be analyzed just like any other factor of production. Well, we'll get into more of the technical analysis of factor markets, later in the week, but as some of you already know, the Austrian analysis of factor markets suggests that labor, like other factors, will be hired in a competitive market up to the point where the payment to the factor owner, the supplier of the service, in this case a wage, is just equal to the discounted marginal revenue product of labor in terms of how much it contributes to the employer, the buyer of labor services, how much it contributes kind of to their bottom line. Okay. I think mainstream economists would also acknowledge that, there's kind of a psychology literature or organization theory literature on entrepreneurs, which, describes, entrepreneurial behavior as a kind of a personality type, the go-getter, the innovator, the more creative type, someone who has a lot of initiative, or someone who can persevere through different kind of obstacles, or someone who's very confident in their ability to bring about a desired outcome, maybe overconfident, as some of the literature suggests. In this perspective, entrepreneurship isn't, it's not harmful. It might actually contribute something to desirable outcomes, but it's really not a big deal analytically, right? The entrepreneur doesn't play a special role. We don't need some special kind of analysis to explain the entrepreneur. We just incorporate entrepreneurship into labor economics. Well, you can sort of tell where I'm going with this. That is not the Austrian view, right? In the Austrian view, entrepreneurship is something special. And what I find to be the most concise summary or definition is that entrepreneurship is judgmental decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, judgment under uncertainty. And I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit as we go. In this sense, entrepreneurship is a form of human action, right? The entrepreneur is an actor, but entrepreneurship is different from labor, different from the provision of labor services. It's not the same thing as management or creating businesses or being an inspirational leader. It's something unique. Okay, what is that unique thing? Well, Mises talks about entrepreneurship in both a broad sense and a more narrow sense. And so in the broad sense, entrepreneurship is action under uncertainty, or the act of bearing, dealing with the consequences of action under uncertainty. I mean, Mises says this quite plainly in Human Action. The term entrepreneur, as used by theory, by economic theory, means acting man exclusively seen from the aspect of the uncertainty inherent in every action. Okay? So human action is purposeful, right? Human beings they employ means to try to achieve objectives, but outside of some kind of abstract model like what Mises and Rothbard called the evenly rotating economy, right? Action in the real world, is characterized by a lack of certainty about whether the action will bring about the desired end, right? I mean, I think of you guys, coming to a lecture like this, right? I mean, you do bear some cost of coming here, even though, like to my talk specifically, let's assume you're already on the premises. I'm not talking about your plane ticket. But, there's an opportunity cost of being here. You could be taking a nap, as Professor Newman suggested you would be doing. You could be watching a Netflix, video or whatever. So you do bear an opportunity cost of being here, sitting in the room right now. But presumably you chose to come to the lecture because you anticipated that the benefits you would receive would be greater than the costs that you would incur. What are the benefits? New knowledge, right? Inspiration, entertainment, just staring at a really good-looking man. I mean, that's part of it. It's a consumption benefit. Not getting yelled at by Felicia, for skipping a session. We could enumerate some of those. And you came because you expected those benefits to be greater than the opportunity cost. And, probably, almost certainly, definitely for all of you, you'll decide later that you were right, that the benefits were vast and the opportunity cost was small. But, it's theoretically possible, though highly unlikely, that you might walk out of the lecture dissatisfied. I didn't like what that guy said. I didn't understand him at all. He didn't look that good. Again, it's on paper that could happen. And then you would decide that, the benefits were not worth the cost. It's like you earned a loss instead of a profit, a psychic loss or something. And you would regret your decision ex post. So when we engage in purposeful human action, we don't know for certain if we will achieve the objectives that we're aiming or striving toward. And so entrepreneurship is, we analyze entrepreneurship as that aspect of human action. How does that uncertainty impact decisions that are made? How do human actors think about managing or maybe mitigating that uncertainty? How do they respond subsequent to the results of action? How do we, what are the implications of uncertainty for understanding how the world works? Okay. Now, there's also kind of a narrower notion a subset or a specialized way of thinking about acting under uncertainty. You know, I call this entrepreneurship in the narrow sense or in the commercial sense, right? This is the act of combining and recombining productive factors, land, labor, capital, right, in pursuit of a monetary profit. Okay, so again, you know, if you got more out of the lecture than the opportunity cost, we could say you got a psychic benefit, a psychological profit, or something like that. But, you know, no offense, but most economists are not all that interested in you, right? We're really interested in the kinds of action under uncertainty that have a big impact on our lives. You know, the actions of specialized commercial entrepreneurs who are going out into the factor markets, the input markets. They're buying machines, they're hiring labor, they're renting land and whatever, and they're combining these productive factors to try to produce iPhones and automobiles and housing and restaurant meals and, you know, other outputs that are very important to us as sort of a society. I like the way it's described by an Austrian economist named Ludwig Lachmann, who is not as well known today, but in his book, a book he published in the 1950s on capital theory, he says, "We are living in a world of unexpected change, i.e. uncertainty, right? Hence capital combinations of capital goods used by business people will be ever changing, will be dissolved and reformed. In this activity, we find the real function of the entrepreneur." Okay, so the real function of the entrepreneur, the important function, the significant function, the function that we're really interested in at the end of the day, is this constant combining and recombining of productive factors in pursuit of monetary profit. Okay, and as we'll see when we get into economic calculation tomorrow, you know, one thing that distinguishes this form of entrepreneurship from the more general form is that the entrepreneur typically has a kind of a feedback mechanism. If the outlays, the purchasing or renting of factors is done in money, in a monetary unit, and the returns, the receipts, the revenues are also in the same monetary unit, you can compare revenues and costs, right? You can attach a cardinal number to your profit or your loss, and that may be useful to you in your decision making. Right? Psychic profit, we can kind of, you know, have a loose, instinctive, intuitive understanding, but we don't have cardinal numbers to attach to it. Okay. So being able to calculate monetary profit and loss turns out to be central to Mises' critique of socialism, as you'll see in Professor Salerno's talk tomorrow. Who cares? Why is this a big deal? Well, again, let me quote Ludwig von Mises. Mises says, "It is impossible to eliminate the entrepreneur from the picture of a market economy." Okay, that's a pretty strong statement. Not eliminating the entrepreneur makes the picture of the market economy a little bit worse. Okay, that's not what he says. It's like you cannot understand a market economy, an economy with private property, market exchange, prices, so-called catalactic behavior, to use a Misesian term. You cannot understand that without understanding the entrepreneur, which is why I'm pretty much the most important speaker at this whole event. Let's just get that out of the way. But look at what he says next. He says, "The various complementary factors of production cannot come together spontaneously. They need to be combined by the purposive efforts of men aiming at certain ends and motivated by the urge to improve their state of satisfaction. In eliminating the entrepreneur, one eliminates the driving force of the whole market system." Okay, so the driving force of the whole market system is this actor, this action, this function of purposefully arranging factors of production in pursuit of profit and desiring to avoid loss. Again, this is not, state planners' purposive behavior, okay? These are private actors who are engaged in voluntary exchange. But, some of you might have heard kind of the market system or the division of labor described as a spontaneous order. That's a term that was popularized by Hayek. Rhetorically, there may be some force to using that language. And, you can sort of understand what Hayek was trying to get at. He was saying the order that comes about from the market is not imposed by the state. in a top-down fashion. That's true, but I think the term spontaneous order can be a little bit misleading or imprecise because it implies that, I don't know, a Boeing 747 just sort of spontaneously appears. No, I mean, you've got human actors, you've got capitalists, you've got entrepreneurs, you've got laborers, other suppliers of factor services who are making conscious and purposeful decisions that result in the creation of this airplane. And you've got one particular set of actors, the entrepreneurs, who really were aiming at producing an airplane. Right? Hayek's argument is sometimes, we engage in action that results in unintended consequences that the actor did not foresee. And that's certainly true. But in this case, the entrepreneurs did foresee the outcome. That was the whole point of them coordinating all these factors, because they wanted to produce, they wanted to start a particular company or produce a particular good or service. They wanted to earn a particular profit that they had in mind. It's very conscious and deliberate, private, of course, and decentralized in the sense that they don't, they can't compel other people to participate against their will. But it's not spontaneous, meaning unplanned, okay? Now, again, later in the week, we'll get into more of the details of how Austrians understand production, the production of goods and services. How do we distinguish between inputs and outputs? And I think Patrick Newman will talk about capital theory tomorrow and the different stages of production. Some of you might have seen this triangle diagram, so-called Hayekian triangle, on how the structure of production in the economy as a whole is affected by changes in interest rates and so forth. Austrians are very famous for developing a theory of what they call imputation, right? Imputation is the idea that the value of an input, like an hour's worth of labor or the use of a machine for a certain period of time, or the value of owning some tool or piece of equipment, is determined by its contribution to producing final goods and services, and then the value of those final goods and services to the consumer. It's a reversal of the Marxist idea, which he got from some of the classical economists. They made an error here. You've heard of maybe the labor theory of value, the idea that the value of goods and services to the consumer is somehow determined by the value of the factors, labor in particular, that went into their production. The Austrians pointed out that no, the causation goes the other way around. It's the value of the outputs that is imputed backwards up the supply chain to give the inputs value. If the output is not desired by consumers, it doesn't matter how much input goes into the production. Those inputs won't be desirable to entrepreneurs. They won't command a high price on the market. Okay. And as was already mentioned by Jonathan Newman, all this relates to the problem of economic calculation under socialism, which I think Salerno will cover. Okay, earlier I used this word judgment. I talked about judgmental decision-making under uncertainty. There's some subtlety here because the way we use the word judgment in English and in some other languages, you said, you tell your friend, don't be so judgmental. It's like you're being bossy or you're being picky, or that's not what we mean here. Judgment, as Mises uses the term, this term is also used by Frank Knight, the American economist, famous for writing about uncertainty. Judgment is a strictly formal kind of construct, right? Judgment refers to decision-making under uncertainty. This is my definition, but it's an interpretation of what Mises says. Judgment is decision-making under uncertainty without a formal model or a decision rule. In other words, again, like your decision to come to the lecture or not, you did not have access to a mathematical model, right, where you can just plug certain things in and it tells you what to do. Yeah, of course, you can ask ChatGPT what to do. I'm not saying you can't construct some kind of a simulation, but that simulation does not ultimately compel you to attend the lecture or not. That's a decision that only you can make using your own subjective interpretation and intuition, right? In fact, other words that we use for judgment in this sense are intuition or kind of gut feeling. The Germans have a term verstehen, which is usually translated into English as understanding, but it means a kind of a deep fundamental understanding, right? So think about it this way. You say, oh, well, can't we build a mathematical model that will predict how much benefit I will get from attending Klein's talks? And essentially that's what my LLM is doing. And so the LLM is really the decision maker, so it's not judgment. But the problem is, the LLM, at least, I don't know if these haven't been invented yet. The LLM is not like a physical Terminator robot that can grab you by the back of the neck and plunk you down in the seat as you're kicking and screaming, right? You had to choose whether or not to ask ChatGPT, and you had to choose whether or not to follow the advice given to you by ChatGPT, which, of course, as we know, LLMs make a lot of mistakes. Right? There's no guarantee that you're doing the right thing when you ask AI to help you make a decision. Only a human being can make that ultimate decision about whether to move forward or not, though the human being can certainly ask, computer models for help, just like you could ask another human being for advice. Okay, but it's ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to make the decision. The actor chooses to act or not to act. Listen to how Mises puts it. Mises says, the real entrepreneur is a speculator, a man eager to utilize his opinion about the future structure of the market for business operations promising profits. Again, here's the key phrase. Like Jonathan Newman, I'm going to say it, then I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit. Mises said, Mises' writing in English is very precise, but you can tell he's a native German speaker, right? That precision sometimes is hard for we moderns to follow exactly, okay? But once you analyze it, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. It's crystal clear, okay? So Mises says, this specific anticipative understanding of the conditions of the uncertain future defies any rules and systematization. It can be neither taught nor learned. The entrepreneur sees the past and the present as other people do, but he judges the future in a different way. Okay, let me break it down for you. Okay, specific anticipative understanding. That's what he means verstehen, right? This kind of, there's a tacit element to it. It's particular to the circumstances of time and place in which the actor is making the decision. It's anticipative, meaning it's forward-looking, right? It defies any rules and systematization, meaning there's not a formula. You can't just follow a little, have you ever seen those little decision trees that they use in game theory? And you can't just follow a decision tree and be told what to do. Okay, it can't be broken down and reproduced in that manner. It can be neither taught nor learned. Again, what he means is, you can't read a book on how to decide whether to attend Klein's lecture, and then you just know whether attending the lecture will bring you a net positive psychic benefit. I mean, somebody should write a book like that for sure. That'd be a topic everyone would be interested in, but such a book does not exist. And again, the entrepreneur, he sees the past and the present as other people do, but he judges the future in a different way. The entrepreneur has a unique, impossible to parameterize or mathematize fully understanding of the future that is the basis for his action. Okay, now I said earlier, we're interested in how the entrepreneur sort of operationalizes or manifests his or her judgment, and it comes in the form of ownership, right? So this actor who is the driving force of the market is not just an entrepreneur in some abstract sense, but is what Mises calls a capitalist entrepreneur. Okay, so really to understand what Mises means, we need to bring together the idea of the entrepreneur with the idea of the capitalist, which, by the way, would make a great book title. If only someone would write a book that has to do with this intersection of the capitalist and the entrepreneur functions. And then if only that book were available in the bookstore downstairs, and if only the author got royalties. No. So to be an entrepreneur in Mises' sense, you got to have something on the line. You got to have skin in the game, right? So, a taxi driver who is paid a wage by the taxi company and engages with a capital asset, the taxi that is owned by the taxi company, is an employee providing labor services. An Uber driver who owns the vehicle is legally and economically, classified as an independent contractor, right, who is essentially an entrepreneur in Mises' sense, who pays Uber, which is a technology platform for brokering rides, brokering deals with customers, right? So we think about the difference. The Uber driver is responsible for maintaining the value of the asset, right? The Uber driver is sort of the residual claimant on any kind of net revenues, net of costs, maintenance costs, and fuel costs, and so forth. The Uber driver bears the uncertainty associated with engaging in trying to provide rides for other people. A taxi driver who gets paid a fixed wage is not a residual claimant, right? Is not a residual decision maker, is not an owner, is an employee. Okay, I'm not saying one is a better or wiser arrangement than the other, but you have to own capital and have assets at risk, skin in the game, to be classified as an entrepreneur in Mises' sense. So again, to recap what I said on the previous slide, what the entrepreneur is doing is buying or renting capital goods, factors of production, in the present, today, and then deploying them in pursuit of profits that will only materialize in the future. Right, the revenues only come in the future. You net out your costs. You either have profit or loss left over, right? And you don't know for sure at the time of action whether your actions will yield profit or loss, okay? This is hard, right? It's not easy to do this because capital goods are diverse, meaning they're highly specific. Most capital goods are not perfectly substitutable across activities, so you might misallocate. You might have the wrong kind of car. You might have the wrong kind of machine. You might have combined factors in a way that yields a lower financial return than some other combination. And there's an almost infinite array of possible combinations of factors of production, especially capital goods, because of their heterogeneity or uniqueness, okay? I want to just dive a little bit deeper into uncertainty, because I've used the word uncertainty without really defining it exactly. So some of you may have heard of distinction, again, that was sort of popularized by an important American economist named Frank Knight, distinction between risk and uncertainty. In fact, we often use the term Knightian uncertainty to refer to uncertainty as opposed to probabilistic risk. And what Knight had in mind is that if you think about, throwing dice, like if you have a normal six-sided die, okay, when you throw the die, you do not know which number will come up, right? It could be a 1, 2, 3, all the way through a 6 if it's a normal die, okay? So yeah, so you could say, well, when I throw the die, I don't know what the future outcome is going to be, but it's a very well understood situation. It's easy to characterize the situation mathematically with like a probability distribution function, right? There are six possible outcomes. I can identify the 6 possible outcomes, and I know that each one will occur with probability 1/6. So, if I'm doing casino gambling or I have some kind of a expected utility model, here's the benefit of rolling a 3, and here's how much it costs me to roll, and the probability of it landing on a 3 is 1/6. I can multiply everything out and calculate an expected value. Okay. Knight argued that there are many situations in life, including most business decision-making situations, that are not like that, right? We can't even list all the possible future outcomes, much less assign numerical probabilities to them. So that kind of mathematical probabilistic reasoning doesn't apply in most situations of human action, certainly most business situations. So Knight used the word uncertainty to describe situations where you cannot do like what you can do with throwing dice. Okay, you don't know the range of possible outcomes. You don't know the mathematical probabilities. And there are different reasons for that. Sort of mainstream economists have adopted a slightly different understanding, which mostly comes from John Maynard Keynes, surprisingly, who wrote a book on probability theory in the 1920s, around the same published in the same year as Knight's book, but much worse. In this approach, probabilities are just kind of random conjectures, and we don't try to explain what probability. They're beliefs on the part of decision makers. So I can say I'm launching a company, and the probability that I'll break even by the end of the first year is 0.26. And that just exists as an objective fact. That's my subjective belief. No, it can't be questioned. It can't be analyzed. All we can say as economists is that, Klein has this probability 0.26. That's neither rational nor irrational. That's just whatever it is. But we can say that if Klein receives some additional feedback in the future, he's supposed to adjust his belief in a certain way using what's called Bayes' rule. You may have heard of Bayes' rule or Bayes' theorem. It's a function that says how you should change a belief in response, how a rational person would update their beliefs in response to new information. So the mainstream economists believe that we don't really care what people's prior beliefs are, but we model them as updating the beliefs following Bayes' law or Bayes' rule. In finance, they have a notion they call ambiguity, which is like, it's like I know the probability distribution function, but there's like three different functions that could obtain. I don't know which one of the three obtains in reality, which is really just another way of modeling probabilistic risk. Okay. Ludwig von Mises uses a related set of concepts that he actually got from his brother. Mises had a younger brother named Richard von Mises, who was, talk about, genetics. He was a brilliant mathematician and probability theorist, professor at Harvard for many years. His best known book is Probability, Statistics, and Truth. And Richard von Mises introduced a distinction that he calls case probability and class probability. Class probability refers to situations in which we can calculate probabilities through experimentation. So he says, think about throwing the dice, right? What if you could not figure out that the probability of hitting a 3 is 1/6 just by looking at it, right? For some reason, you're an Austrian, so you're not good at math. Okay, so you have no idea. Richard von Mises says, well, what you could do is just start rolling the dice. You could just throw the die and record what number comes up each time. And, you throw it once, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. You just keep throwing it and throwing it and throwing it. And if it's a normal die, right, in the limit, as the number of throws approaches infinity, the frequency with which a 3 comes up approaches 1/6. Right? So probabilities are limit frequencies in situations where each event that we're interested in is one element of a class of nearly identical events. Okay, that's what it means to call something a probability. That's what it means when we say the probability is 1/6. However, according to Richard von Mises, and Ludwig embraces the same distinction, there are other situations where each event is unique and cannot be bundled together in a class of events that are similar in a meaningful way. So you don't have a frequency distribution, right? People say, oh, well, in Auburn, Alabama, if a new restaurant is introduced, 100 new restaurants have been introduced over some period, and only 10 out of the 100 were still in business a year later. Okay, so you say, well, then if I'm going to launch a restaurant, the probability of success is 1/10. Okay, but each restaurant is very different from every other restaurant. A restaurant entrepreneur who made the decision only based on that frequency tabulation would probably not be a very good entrepreneur. Every restaurant is different cuisines, different business model, different locations, different pricing. It might be useful for me to know that only 10 out of 100 of the other restaurants made it, but I presumably have some reason to believe my restaurant is more likely to make it than that. Right? So I cannot use the same frequency tabulations to guide my decision-making when each event is unique. Each case is unique. And notice that there's an element of subjectivity here, right? Because it's up to a human actor or a group of human actors to determine whether case probability or class probability applies, right? Is each case of a restaurant being opened sufficiently similar to every other case of a restaurant being opened that we can put them in a class? I think most restaurateurs would say no. But you could also say each throw of the dice is not literally identical. You might be gripping it tighter or more loosely. Your arm might be more extended or less extended. But most of us believe that those differences are trivial, They don't really affect what number is going to come out. So we can assume, we can act as if each element of the class is literally identical. But again, that's a question for market participants to work out, okay? If you're really interested in delving deep into uncertainty, it just so happens that there are a few recent articles, including one that was just published a couple months ago by myself and some co-authors that look at different ways uncertainty has been handled in the literature, and I certainly encourage you to download those and read them. Okay, so the reason that we care about all this, as I mentioned before, is that the skill with which the entrepreneur engages in judgment about the future is what determines whether entrepreneurs earn profits or losses. Okay, so in a kind of a long-run equilibrium state, the so-called evenly rotating economy, every factor is paid its discounted marginal revenue product to the penny. Owners of firms earn some kind of return, an implicit wage for sacrificing immediate consumption, deferring their own payment until the future when revenues are received from consumers. Capitalists earn some interest, implicitly or explicitly based on time preference. But that's it. There's nothing left. There's no residual, there's no leftover profit or loss. Outside the evenly rotating economy, i.e. in the real world, right, some entrepreneurs are better than other entrepreneurs in anticipating future market conditions, in figuring out, in making a good intuitive judgment about what consumers will buy and how much consumers will be willing to pay and what competitors might do and so forth. Okay, so entrepreneurs are competing with each other for factors based on their knowledge and beliefs about the present, technology, capabilities, resources, and so forth, and more importantly, their beliefs about the future. So in other words, the actual marginal revenue product of a factor is not given at the time that factor purchase or rental is made. It's a guess about what, because revenues only come in the future. So the marginal revenue products or the discounted marginal revenue products only come into existence in the future after action has been undertaken. They're just estimated at the time of action. So those who are more skilled at estimating these marginal revenue products will tend to be more successful in entrepreneurship than those who are less capable, and that's where we get profit. That's what underlies profits and losses. And of course, in a market economy, you have competition among entrepreneurs. Those who are better at entrepreneurship will earn profits, they'll accumulate more profits, they'll be able to reinvest, expand their businesses, and so forth. Those who earn losses will eventually be selected out of the market. So the competitive market process gives us a tendency for more entrepreneurial activity to be in the hands of the more capable entrepreneurs. Mises says this in his short book, Profit and Loss. If entrepreneurs fail to produce in the cheapest and best possible way those commodities which consumers are asking for most urgently, they suffer losses and are finally eliminated from their entrepreneurial position. Other men who know better how to serve the consumers replace them. So the market process for Mises is this process of selection among entrepreneurs, the process of putting different entrepreneurial judgments to the test and seeing which entrepreneurs are more skilled at engaging in judgment, in doing it well. It's not the same thing as the convergence towards equilibrium within a given market, which is what the term market process is sometimes taken to mean, even within the Austrian School. Rothbard makes the same point using slightly different language. The profit maker is allocating factors where they had been undervalued as compared to the consumer's desires. The greater a man's profit has been, the more praiseworthy his role, for then the greater is the maladjustment that he alone has uncovered and is combating. The greater a man's losses, the more blameworthy he is, for the greater has been his contribution to maladjustment. In other words, when you hear, your Marxist friends, talk about how evil profits are and, no, the profit system, which you should always correct your Marxist friend, a more accurate term is the profit and loss system. They usually act as if profits are just sort of automatic, right? The profit and loss system is the way of assuring that society's resources are being allocated in the most efficacious ways. Rothbard goes further with characteristically Rothbardian prose, where he calls this person the bumbling loser. Okay? We should not be too hard on the bumbling loser. He receives his penalty in the form of losses. Anyway, you can go. The vision of the bumbling loser is one of my favorites. Okay. So in summary, right, entrepreneurship is best understood as judgmental decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. And in the more specific sense, this buying and selling, renting, and ceasing to rent factors of production and combining them in the attempt to produce goods and services that consumers will want to buy. Okay? Without that entrepreneurial function, we don't have companies, we don't have networks of producers and so forth that give us the goods and services that we require. So entrepreneurship is not just a specialized add-on to the study of economics. It's not the economics of small business or something like that. Entrepreneurship is the driving force, in Mises' words, of the market economy, and thus something that we all need to study and appreciate very carefully. Thank you.